Haley. Hey there, are we recording? And now we're recording. Okay, so we're live here at the beginning of the Kelley Family Week. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Blake Bradley. I'm a senior at the Kelley School, double majoring in supply chain management and sustainable business. I'm super excited to introduce you to our panelists tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking all about healthcare, and the wonderful guests that we have with us all at some point were like all of you, Kelley students. And so we're going to talk a little bit tonight about a variety of things from their Kelley journey to where they are now, their thoughts on the coronavirus, the vaccine. Perhaps we might get there as well. But what I'm most excited about is the people we have with us. I really think we could cure coronavirus right here tonight if we put our minds to it. I think we could. We have everybody we need. We've got the government support. We could even buy a couple companies with Derek's expertise here. So I want to jump in, let our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll start with Sarah Jo. Will you tell us a little bit about yourselves and your journey, Sarah?
So thanks for having me, and I'm a proud Kelley alum from the Physician Executive MBA program, just graduated in May. I started out as a chemical engineer and went on to medical school. That was always the plan, but it gave me a different way of thinking. Did residency and fellowship in internal medicine, hematology, and oncology, which makes me a cancer doctor. I'm currently the medical director of the IU Simon Cancer Center. And as part of my Kelley journey, I was building and opening the new Schwarz Cancer Center, which we have up at IU North in Carmel. So it was perfect for me to have a living laboratory to use all of the things that I was studying at the Kelley School while building that cancer center and opening it. Glad to be here.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah Jo. And do you want to tell us the exciting news as well about your move to Seattle?
So I'm in the middle, and I just sold my house in 3 days above asking, so I'm very happy. I am moving to Seattle, where I will be the executive medical director for the Swedish Cancer Institute, which has nothing to do with the country of Sweden, but it's part of the Providence healthcare system, Providence St. Joe's, which has healthcare in 8 states.
Wow, well, that's great. Very exciting. Awesome. And then Dan Peterson, will you tell us a little bit about yourself? Thanks for being here tonight.
Absolutely, glad to be here. Sorry I'm doing so from an automobile. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Hopefully I'm not making anybody sick by shaking the phone too much. So getting busy. But again, yeah, sorry to have to join from this venue, if you will. Really happy to be here. Obviously, like Sarah was, am a proud Kelley alum from just a few years ago. So went to IU's undergrad back in got there in 1980, and ended up, like her, I actually had a medical background or medical pathway, and actually went to IU's med school thinking I was going to be a doctor. For a number of reasons, decided not to do that, worked for a year, and then came back and got my MBA at IU in Bloomington. This was long before it was called Kelley, and actually learned about the Cook organization back while I was in MBA school. I was lucky enough to find a summer job. This was back before we had internships, if you will, and that was 32 years ago, or 31 plus years ago. Been there ever since. So glad to be here and look forward to your questions.
That's great, Dan. Thank you so much. And Derek Hicks, it's all you.
All right, Blake. I feel like the least intelligent person, at least virtually, between Dan and Sarah Jo. So I'm very humbled and very excited to be on this panel with them. And Blake, thank you very much for this, and hello everyone. So my name is Derek Hicks. I currently let me go back. So I'm a mechanical engineering by an undergrad. I actually have a bachelor's and a master's in mechanical engineering, and actually used to design jet engines for Pratt & Whitney. And decided that I wanted to go back and get an MBA. So, and also had an interest in finance and investment banking. So I went to Kelley, got my MBA from the Kelley School in 2002, and joined Pfizer in 2000, and had a very wonderful 18-year run at Pfizer. Eventually moved into business development, and before I left, I was the head of corporate development, which essentially was all major transactions that Pfizer did, essentially anything that was probably multi-billion dollars, whether it was a buying or exiting. Currently, I just left literally 4 weeks ago. I'm at a company called Spark, which is a gene therapy company that I'm happy to talk about. But I'm also happy to talk about Pfizer. I know the company fairly well. I'll speak obviously to everything what's in the public domain, but certainly obviously happy to entertain questions on both. And again, look forward to interacting with this wonderful group.
Derek, it's too bad that you say you won't comment on anything that's not public info. I was hoping we could do some insider trading here tonight, but maybe that's for another webinar. We'll save it for the next webinar. That's great. Well, it's really good to have everybody here. One of the reasons I'm most excited for this panel is not only is it extremely timely, but healthcare is something that a lot of our students want to go into, but it's not one of our traditional Kelley paths per se. When students come into Kelley, they find themselves going into investment banking, consulting, accounting, finance, these sort of things. But you all have used your Kelley degree and your Kelley experience to kind of propel yourself to a different path. And I think that that's something that our students really look up to. And I mean, we see here, our numbers climbing. We have 23 people here with us tonight. So I think that's really great. Dan, I want to start with a question for you, if you don't mind. Something that I'm really passionate about is government. As president of Kelley Student Government, we have a lot of members here tonight from government. And one day I myself want to get into government. So can you give us a little bit of background on how you interact with the government in your role?
Sure, happy to. So my role is part of a team. We have a relatively small team given the size of our organization. So for those of you who don't know, Cook's about a 13,000 employee company, privately held still, obviously based in Bloomington. But for the size of the organization, we have a relatively small government affairs team. Three of those folks are based out of Washington, D.C., actually now all working from home, as many of us are. And then the other part of our team, there's two of us back, actually three of us back here based in one in Indianapolis and myself and another based in Bloomington. And so our involvement with government crosses the gamut from local and state government all the way to federal government issues. And of course, the majority of our issues, if you will, from a government standpoint, the policy and legislative standpoint, typically happen at the federal level. For us, obviously related to FDA and regulatory policy and regulatory issues, but also reimbursement through Medicare and those types of things. So a lot of our issues are certainly at the federal level. We all dabble in different parts of that. But we all form our strategy as a whole. So between the six of us, and then we obviously have our own implementation of those strategies. And I should include the international piece of that. We have locations in multiple countries around the globe. So we have government affairs activity in each of those countries as well.
Well, and I think it's really interesting because all three of you here represent a different perspective of how any sort of virus, but particularly the COVID-19 pandemic, impacts businesses. You all have very different perspectives on how that hits. So I'm going to ask this question to Dan first, and then Sarah Jo, I'll come to you, and then Derek. But I want to ask, when the COVID-19 pandemic started, I myself was lucky enough to be studying abroad in Spain, and the news in Spain, like most news in Spain, travels very slowly. But I know in the US, the news was traveling, around the beginning of the year, January, February. And I'm curious how it impacted your specific role. So Dan, starting with you, and then like I said, we'll go to Sarah Jo, see how it impacted you. Do you remember when you first started hearing about COVID-19 and how did it impact your role right off the bat?
Yeah, I remember it like it was yesterday in some respects. So we had a little bit of a heads up of what was coming to the United States, in that we have some facilities over in Asia Pacific. So we knew from our facilities over there what was coming with the COVID virus in a little bit more detail than perhaps we would get from the general media, if you will. So what that allowed us to do was to begin our planning work around, how are we gonna keep our facility open and operating? We're a medical device company primarily, so we knew we didn't have the luxury of working everybody from home by any means. It was hugely important to us. So your question about my specific involvement, like many of us, we all dove into issues around COVID and what that might mean for our facility. We developed a large executive response team to look at how we were planning for keeping the facility open, if you will, and each of us had various roles. My role in particular was to look external and look at other partners that we could work with in the state of India as well as outside to kind of share best practice and think about, what are we accessing, what are we able to access as far as knowledge and resources. And so it was all hands on deck for what seemed like months and months and months. But so far, so good.
That's good. And my supply chain mind is just like, I had a big class day on risk analysis, and I'm sure the word supply chain came up in every single one of your meetings every day, I'm sure. And risk mitigation is the big deal. So Sarah Jo, we have a question here that was submitted before that, it goes in the same vein of this, is how did people in the medical community, what was the initial reaction of it coming to the US? And did you see a heightened fear response than what people were seeing maybe on the news or in any of their social media sites?
Thank you. So I will be going to Washington State, which is where the first cases were. So I was already in communication with them about this potential job at that time. So I had a little bit of an inkling. But if you ask what was our response, there was absolute terror because the virus had so many unknowns associated with it. The lethality was very high. We didn't have enough supplies, or we weren't sure that we had enough supplies, and we didn't understand what was happening. And for a lot of it, we were creating process as we were using process. So I'll give a couple of examples if I may. First, I want to commend IU Health. I think IU Health did a spectacular job in managing this. Unlike many systems across the country, IU Health made a commitment up front that they weren't going to lay off or furlough any workers, and they've committed to keeping people's salaries whole, which is a phenomenal outcome for such a big corporation. But up front, we had not only the business piece to manage, but learning the science when there was no information about how to manage these patients was very challenging. In the face of the unknown, the risk of transmission to the medical staff was high. There have been over 600 doctors, right, in Italy who died in the pandemic. So the 600 healthcare workers, many of whom were doctors and nurses. So from a business perspective, I had to worry about my employee workforce as well as supply chain for those supplies, managing the patients or creating our product of good healthcare while we were doing all of this. I'll throw in another thing, which is that telemedicine, which you may hear about a lot, we were not utilizing. And in 2 weeks, I stood up telemedicine for the cancer center. So I had to take all of the faculty who were not registered, had never done telehealth, and create workflows and processes for telemedicine, get them up to speed. I threw out all of the elderly faculty. I threw them out of the hospital and made them work from home because they were at risk if they saw patients, but they were also the least tech savvy. So trying to get them up to speed, and then behind the scenes, so that's the doctor's most obvious piece, but all of the support staff, all of the infrastructure for telemedicine had to be brought up to speed at the same time. And so there were a lot of challenges moving at once. One of the hardest ones was that we had so many dedicated people who wanted to help, but they were afraid for their families. So we had doctors and nurses who were sleeping in their garage rather than going into the house because they didn't want to bring the virus home to their families. So as a health system, the system also stood up hotel rooms, showers on site for staff, had to do supply chain to get more scrubs because we didn't have enough scrubs for people to wear who weren't normally wearing scrubs. We took over some of your dormitories in downtown IUPUI territory so that people who didn't want to go home because they had an immunocompromised family member could stay at the dorms. They took over a hotel room. So it was a huge enterprise. And a lot of the business skills came into play. I don't want to talk too long, but I will say that I was on 5 meetings today preparing for this next wave that's already happening. It's coming. Our numbers are rising fast. And over the last 4 days, we went from a 9% positive rate to a 14% positive rate. And so we are starting, and we are looking at what we learned from last time and how the pandemic and the treatment of patients is different now than it was 4 months ago, because we have new tools and we've learned more about who needs a ventilator and who doesn't. But we are very actively doing business decision making. For example, whether or not we will shut down elective surgeries, which account for 40% of the revenue. So those are active business decisions embedded within the healthcare system right now.
That's great, Sergio. And I want to come back to the next wave. We have had a lot of questions about the next wave. And I have some questions about the elective surgery thing as well, because I know that that's a really big concern as well. But Dirk, I want to give you a chance to answer this question as well. And a follow-up question on this that somebody asked was, the team here wanted to know, what were you focusing on when coronavirus hit? And how did the whole virus kind of derail it and change where your focus and perspective was?
Yeah, so it's interesting when obviously when the virus hit, I think in January timeframe, December, January, was obviously all over the news, right? So we all heard about it, and I think the real question was, well, when is it going to come to the U.S. and how bad will it be, right? And so as part of the leadership team that I'm on, we actually have employees all over the world. We actually have an employee in China. And literally, for the months of January, February, and March, before before the situation changed in the U.S., I was literally on phone calls with a colleague who, was in her apartment, and she made a comment that literally if she opened the door, an alarm would go off because, China was being pretty firm about people even leaving to just casually go out. So it was pretty clear, that it was fairly serious. But, I remember it also like it was yesterday. So it was, I guess March 8th, when Pfizer sent out a note to all employees saying, if you take public transportation, don't come into the city. And, I take public transportation. So that was, I think March 8th was the last day that I took public transportation into Manhattan. But really it became, I think, 3 areas of focus, and I'll come back to your question. 3 areas of focus really for Pfizer. First was people. It was really just making sure all of our employees were safe and being well taken care of and weren't putting themselves in a bad situation. I think the second was, continuing to supply product, right? Because at the end of the day, we're still a pharmaceutical company. You have to continue manufacturing. So there were all kinds of plans to just make sure that people have the proper PPE and the proper resources so that we can manufacture. And the third was actually the deal that we did with BioNTech. I think our CEO, and he's been all over the news, Albert, was very passionate about, trying to do something here for patients. And, we got this deal done in an amazing quick time. I mean, I've never seen a deal get done this fast. And, he was very passionate about trying to bring a vaccine to patients and do it in a fast manner. But back to your question, I mean, you said what we were focused on before is really no different now than we're focused on previously, which is really for us, it's all about trying to bring products to patients that really are, meaningfully different and impact their lives in a material way, right? So there's really no difference what we're focused on before versus after. How we do it now is very different because, we're all on WebEx or Zoom or whatever calls all day in this room. But, the focus remains the same. And even for my role at Spark, it's really all about how do we bring products to patients that really are very meaningful. So that hasn't changed. And I think even in the case of the coronavirus vaccine, it was really all about, we weren't super focused on a vaccine before, specifically for coronavirus, but when it became evident that there was a need, we wanted to try to bring something to patients quickly. So it's always been the focus, hasn't changed at all.
That's good to know. And I know Pfizer's really been a front runner in all this. I can't turn on CNBC without hearing the name. So I know that that's an exciting thing. I must be for Pfizer, I'm sure.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. When I went to business school, pharma was very high in terms of people wanting to work in the pharmaceutical industry. It was kind of investment banking, consulting, and then pharma. And actually, you were asking that question. We can get to it. There are a lot of people who are ex-investment bankers and consultants who work in pharma and probably work in other medical fields as well too, in healthcare fields. But then, pharma kind of dropped to literally, it was like the tobacco industry. It was that bad at one point. And I think now, because of what a lot of companies are doing, I think that it's back up again. We'll see how long that lasts. But yeah, now it's a better time to be in the pharma industry than it's been the last 10-ish years.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. And I don't remember the exact date, but back in April, they had Fisher Price had taken all their superhero toys off the shelves, and they were all doctors, nurses, and pharmacists, which I
Mhm.
thought was really, really interesting. So, you know, the idea in our children's minds right now of a hero is really switching to medical staff, you know, which is really, I think it's really encouraging,
Agreed.
really
Hey, Blake,
encouraging. Yeah, Dan.
you it may be common knowledge, but I wouldn't want to assume. But aside from Pfizer's, very much out in the front runner status on a U.S. based vaccine, it's interesting to note that two of the other vaccines, U.S. based vaccines, one from Moderna and the other through J&J, are both being manufactured in Bloomington, Indiana, at the facility that we sold, that was called Cofarmica, that we sold to Catalent here
Right.
a couple of years ago. So it's good old Bloomington, right in the heart of the fight for COVID. So it's really cool to see.
No, Dan, I didn't know that. I appreciate you telling me that. I know Catalan just bought that building. It's a beautiful building, but I didn't realize that that was what was going on there. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's a great facility, a great resource, not just for the U.S. but globally as far as their ability to manufacture biopharmaceuticals.
Yeah. Well, we've been so lucky, like Sarah Joe said. I mean, I use case numbers. I am on meetings every week with Dr. Aaron Carroll, who's been our head of our coronavirus response. And he is an absolute wonderful doctor. And he's done a really great job, I think, of handling this. And we're lucky, and Catalan's lucky to have their location here because our case numbers have stayed relatively under control, which a big part of it is our student participation as well, and all the social distancing guidelines and all these other sort of sacrifices that so many people have had to make. But I want to get to our next question, which Sarah Jo, you perfectly towed us into. How is your respective organizations preparing for the second wave? I know that it's going to hit all of us in very different ways. We're all going to be on Zoom and WebEx, I think, for a lot longer than we were expecting to be. And I'm curious to hear how this is going to impact your organization, or how your organization is making business decisions based off the likelihood of the second wave. So Sarah Jo, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So the first question has to do with elective surgeries, and let me explain why. So elective surgeries and bone marrow transplants. So when we have the coronavirus very sick patients, they don't need regular medical care, which is a room and a nurse. They may need high-tech care in an intensive care unit. They may or may not need ventilation. So the staff, as we have to deal with both the physical space and supplies. And if you drive past IU North Hospital, you'll see big holes in the side of the building that they punched out during the middle of the crisis so that they could convert some of those physical regular rooms into negative pressure rooms. They had to push holes into the side of the building so they could put in ventilation and pump the air so that they created more negative pressure rooms for these infectious patients. So one thing was physical space. So we already have a game plan around physical space. There's an 8-stage surge plan that converts one unit that was just a regular floor into an ICU or step-down unit. And there's, based on triggers of the numbers of patients that we have of which types, which unit is next to physically convert over. The second is nursing staff. So the nurse who takes care of you when you've had your appendix out, and the nurse who's taking care of you when you need dialysis and a complex ventilator have different training. And you can't readily switch one to the other. They really need sophisticated training. Also the physicians, but the nurses are the key of this. We're already in a nursing shortage across the country to start with. So this just totally exacerbated it. Right now, IU has put out and is hiring another 100 nurses to be ready for this next surge. So they're hiring 100 traveling nurses for the downtown hospitals to be ready for this next surge. But the same skills to manage these patients are also needed in the post-op arena and in the ORs. So part of canceling elective surgeries is to free up those nursing staff and the ventilators. When you go to sleep to have your appendix out, you're on a ventilator, so the ventilator can breathe for you. If we can stop an elective surgery, we free up not just a ventilator, but also a staff member or multiple staff members who could care for difficult to care for patients. So that's part of the complexity of making that as a business decision. We don't know how long coronavirus is going to be with us. I expect it all the way through 2021 and probably not until mid 2022, if we're lucky, to not be dealing with these kinds of waves. So that means the organization has to survive financially. And so we have to balance not stopping our regular business with being able to handle these surges. And that's where a lot of complex modeling is going into place. I mentioned bone marrow transplant. I'm a cancer specialist, so that's one of the things in my area. If you have a bone marrow transplant, you are in the hospital in an intensive care unit capable room for 30 days. So some of those patients, we have ways we can push that off a month or 2 months or maybe even 3 months without necessarily compromising their survival. If we're going to get slammed and need every ICU patient, I don't necessarily want to do a bone marrow transplant that's going to tie up one of those beds for 30 days. So there's a lot of modeling and guesswork, and that's why we watch every day the different leading indicators to identify what resources we need to protect, whose path we can alter elective surgery or bone marrow transplant so that we keep those resources open. One of the big challenges worldwide in cancer medicine has been that with Corona, all of a sudden you can't go get your mammogram, you can't get your colonoscopy, you can't get your pap smear. And you may be afraid to come into the cancer center to get your treatment. You can't get your surgery to remove your cancer. So we are seeing a shift in cancer cases post-coronavirus where they're being diagnosed at later stages. And that's not only happening in cancer medicine, it's happening in other fields of medicine as well. There are people who died at home rather than go to the emergency room when they had chest pain because they were afraid of the coronavirus. So there's the immediate infection coronavirus impact, and then there are all these downstream effects on other medical problems that we're having to deal with.
Sergio, I have a follow-up question for you is, do you predict the second wave to be worse than the first wave?
So I'm not personally in the prediction business, but all those smart people that I work with do.
And do you anticipate, I know that you're not a city planner by any means, but do you anticipate similar restrictions that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, or do you think we understand it better now?
I think we are not anywhere near restricted enough. When we look, less than 50% of people are wearing their masks. Mm-hmm. That is the simplest, easiest thing we can do to cut it off. And we've seen by, I don't want to get into anything political, but we've seen by various super spreader activities, whether they are political, religious, whatever, that we are seeing the downstream effects of people not following social distancing and mask wearing. And it's easy prevention. And there is not a reputable scientist that I know who believes that herd immunity is the appropriate way to try and manage this. The cost is too high. Yeah. The human cost is too high.
Right. Well, and I always forget that there's so many people that don't wear their mask because students have been really good about it. And in our safe little world of going to class and social distancing and wearing our mask, it seems very safe and happy. But I forget that so many people, I saw a video on TikTok the other day of a concert at University of Central Florida. No mask, no social distancing, people climbing on top of each other. I mean, it's like there's no pandemic. It's interesting.
It's crazy. And if you go back to one of the big early hotspots in Roslyn, New York, it was traced back to one person going to a conference and then one wedding and one funeral.
Wow.
And they had to shut down an entire town because of that.
It's incredible. Well, I want to, Sarah, and Dan and Derek, I want to get right back to your response for this question as well, but we have 2 questions for Sarah Jo in the chat here. Number 1 is, how did your team overcome the shortage of medical supplies when the coronavirus first hit?
So we never really ran out, but we installed practices of reusing things that we wouldn't normally reuse. So when I wore a surgical mask, we actually, those paper blue masks with the the white strings. We were asked to collect those at the end of the day because they were looking into recycling them. My N95 masks, when I went into the ICU to take care of a patient with corona, I was in full PPE, which we didn't reuse, but I was asked to reuse the N95. So I had to put my name on it, and I put it in a paper bag with my name on it to stay overnight so that nobody else was using mine. And at the time, we didn't know. So we reused them 5 times. Now the data says we shouldn't be reusing them more than 3 times. So there were some risks, but I think I think in the greater scheme, me reusing it a 4th time versus somebody not having one at all was the right choice from a business perspective. Our supply chain team was phenomenal. I'm delighted you're going into that field. They were really phenomenal. But don't forget, it wasn't just the PPE. We ran out of medicines. So our Pfizer friends have to work hard too. All of a sudden, having massive numbers, IU North Hospital has an 8-bed ICU. They had 16 patients on ventilators. They had to create more ICUs. They weren't used to that level of the medications that you use to keep a patient sedated while they're on a ventilator. We ran out of those medicines. And so as a huge health system, we were sharing across one another, and we had a great supply chain team who went out and got stuff for us. But we really ran out of medicines, ran out of supplies, just because what we were treating changed.
And Derek or Dan, I don't know, do you guys want to provide any more insight from your side? Or I have one other question for Sarah Jo before we move on. Do either of you want to say anything about the shortage of medical supplies, perhaps?
I mean, the only thing I'll say is that, like as you would expect, right? A lot of these, I think Pfizer obviously tried our best to supply. Everything's based on a forecast, right? As Blake, you all learn, and COVID turned everything completely upside down. So, at a certain point, if there's something that's not used very much, and all of a sudden the demand goes up significantly, that throws off everything, right? So, unfortunately, there's probably only so much you can do to catch up with that unexpected demand. And I think to Sarah Jo's point, hopefully we've all learned now, and people are manufacturing for the second wave. But I think it just probably caught us all off guard based on, models that predict, hey, we're going to have this amount, and this is how much you need to manufacture, and it ended up kind of getting blown out the water. And in other cases, demand was up, as Sarah Jo said, and for certain things, and the demand just went down significantly because people aren't going to go do the routine things that they should because they're just nervous to even go out their house and go to the doctor.
Dan, I saw you on mute.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, just to build on what was said, is that early part we really didn't know, as Sarah and Derek said. And as an example, we were actually working with IU Health across the system. We never actually had to do it, but we were sterilizing N95 masks using our mask sterilizers that we use for medical devices through exploration with the FDA on doing that. We ended up not having to do it because the supply chain system worked well enough on the mask side to keep the system going. But other examples of that included, for all the testing, both IU Health and Eli Lilly in particular within Indiana stepped up in just such a huge way to supplement the testing that was needed across the state that the State Department of Health did not have the capability to do at that point in time. One of the byproducts of all of that testing is that you need all the supplies for that testing to perform. So you had all sorts of efforts to try and help supplement the supply side of that testing work. And one of the companies that we had spun out up in Indianapolis was doing manufacturing viral transfer media for the swab kits, the test kits that were being done. So things that we wouldn't normally do, but just like all the places that we're making hand sanitizer and trying to make ventilators and all those different types of things. So it's pretty unprecedented.
Sarah Jo, I see you have a point there.
Yeah, so I think one of the really exciting things, especially for the Kelley students, is that the innovation that happened was great. I'm moving out to Seattle. My new boss had an article published in the Harvard Business Review about how their health system managed during COVID. And because of the PPE crisis, one of the things they did was push decision-making down to the lowest possible level. But for an example, to save PPE, their nurses figured out that if they used longer IV tubing, they could keep the IV pumps for patients outside of the rooms, and they could interact with the pump without having to get into PPE to care for the patient. Now, normal times, that would have been 6 months to a year to get approved. But in this crisis, the nurses came up with this solution, the system evaluated it, they piloted it, and it saved a tremendous amount of PPE because they could care for the patients when they needed to actually touch the patient, they could. But the rest of the time, they could interact with the pump outside of the room.
It's brilliant. And that's actually our third conversation point after we finish with Derek and Dan's response on the second wave. But I want to talk about all the innovation that has been forced. And I know we've seen some dramatic growth and expansion of things like e-commerce and grocery delivery. People wearing masks is now something that's very normalized. And I think, a lot of things I've read said this will stay around for a long time. So we're going to get to all the innovation because I know that there's a whole conversation to be had there. But Derek, I want to get to you. Tell me a little bit. You were going through all sorts of transitions. You're dealing with COVID, you're dealing with your family, you're keeping yourself safe, and you're switching companies. So how are you anticipating for your company? How is this second wave going to impact your company? And you can either speak about Spark or Pfizer or whichever one you'd like to speak on.
Well, I'll speak about it both. I think it's interesting. Spark, when I was interviewing, listen, when this whole thing first happened, I thought I was going to be back to work by June, July. Even talking to our colleagues in China, when the pandemic hit the U.S. in March, they were back to work. So my expectation was, after 3 months, we'd wear our masks, we do whatever we need to do, and we get this under control, right? So, fast forward, here I am interviewing for a job with Spark Therapeutics, and my first question is, well, when are you all going back to work? Their feedback to me was, and they said this to me several times, the earliest is April 1st. So, I think they've already kind of geared to the fact that this is going to be here with us for a while. Back to Sarah Jo's plan. I mean, her timeline, I think, is obviously further out. And I tend to agree that April 1 is probably going to get likely pushed out. So, I think we're telling our colleagues at Spark, don't come back until, unless you're manufacturing or essential research and development, don't come back until, at least April 1st. And Pfizer also basically did the same thing. Pfizer just kept on pushing it back month after month. My understanding is the latest they said is, Jan 1 at least. So I think most companies have acknowledged that, we're going to be in this for a while. So which I think was nice for me as an employee to get that context so that you're not just planning around a schedule that's just going to end up getting pushed out anyway. But I think we all are acknowledging that we're going to have to deal with this and manage it for a while. So from my perspective, that was really kind of going through this whole transition and really understanding how a different company thought about it. And I've seen so many articles where I think a lot of companies are also getting in the same place where I think the mindset is, the earliest you're going to come back to the office is probably at some point next year.
Yeah, thanks, Derek.
Yep.
Dan, how about you guys over at Cook? I'm sure you still have to be making your devices and doing everything that you do on the day-to-day basis. So how do you plan to respond to the second wave of the coronavirus?
Yeah, so it's an interesting, really interesting conversation from Cook's perspective, given the second wave. So if you look back in March, when it really hit, March and April, it really hit the U.S. in particular. Our business, so we're, as most people know, we're a med device company in particular. Within about a 10-day period, we lost 40% of our business, just dropped right off the table. And a lot of that is the devices that are used for procedures that are quote, non-emergency, if you will. So, what back then was being described as an elective, I don't think anybody in normal times would consider it an elective to have a cancer biopsy or a cardiovascular procedure, et cetera, but for obvious reasons that Sarah Jo had referenced, that's where the hospital systems were. They were being overwhelmed and they had to be prepared to handle that. So our business dropped off for the most part in some big ways. What didn't drop off was the fact that we have an intensive care division of our devices that are used vaccines that are actually, absolutely right in the middle of treating severe COVID patients, hospitalized COVID patients. So that part of our business went through the roof. Now it's a small, volume part of our business, but we absolutely had to do some really dramatic cross training and moving supply chain resources, everything we could to meet the expanded demand for those products. So, long story short, we've done a great job around the globe to keep our manufacturing facilities safe, and we've been extremely careful and followed absolute best practice on any number of things from ventilation of our manufacturing areas to temperature taking and everything under the sun, social distancing, of course, and barriers, et cetera. And we've had really good luck with that. So with the second wave, we believe and we're seeing that it's going to, certainly be significant across the globe. What we don't know is, what will that do to quote elective procedures and that sort of thing. Like we believe it'll be different than it was the first time around. But certainly, there's going to be a lot of variability to that. We really don't know how bad things are going to get. So a lot of scenario planning.
Yeah, the second wave is going to be something really interesting. I know, I listen to Dr. Carroll talk about it, and I see what universities across the nation have done. And it's interesting. It's going to be, I read an article today in CNN. One of the doctors from New York, I believe, was saying that this is going to be some of the darkest 4 to 5 months that's upcoming if we're not careful. It's going to be some of the darkest 4 to 5 months in modern American history, is what he said. But what I want to do now is I want to switch something a little more positive, a little less doom and gloom, because I think we've had more than enough doom and gloom in our lives across the board. So what I want to do is, first of all, say I'm getting all this feedback on my phone here. I'm trying to stay away from it, but it's on fire right now. The people are just raving about the intellectual horsepower that we have on this team. I mean, it's absurd. And you're lucky. Everybody here is lucky that I'm being under control, because I want to geek out and talk about supply chain so badly right now, but I'm going to hold it in because it's a really important topic. And like Sarah Jo said, I'm super excited because now, when I was a freshman, I had to explain what supply chain was. Now everybody knows it. Everybody says the word every day. So now I don't have to explain anymore. I'm really lucky. But what I want to talk about is innovation. And there's been a lot of very positive stories that have come out of the coronavirus. And whether it's a small story of somebody delivering groceries for their elderly neighbor, or we see some massive form of innovation like the one that Sarah Jo said. So maybe each of you, and I want to be conscious of our time as well. We have 15 minutes left. Maybe each of you could share one piece of innovation that you've been very proud of from your organization, or a piece of innovation or excitement that you've heard of in this industry. And maybe Derek, we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's probably a no-brainer. I mean, certainly I think Pfizer moved very quickly on this vaccine, even though I'm not there anymore. But I think, and obviously I think this work for a vaccine has been going on for a while, right? So, I mean, even though Pfizer's moved quickly, there was a lot of work that was being done, even before the pandemic around this vaccine. I think a lot of the work that was done in the past laid the foundation for this to be done in such speed. But I think, what Pfizer has done and what Albert, our CEO, has done in terms of his commitment to really hopefully let the science, guide us, and the investment that Pfizer is making, I think is absolutely amazing. I think, there are a couple of things that are certainly in the public domain. I think there's an article either today or yesterday that, Pfizer is already in the process of making, and I knew this a couple of months ago, but it became public, that we're making hundreds of millions of doses already at risk, right? And trying to get those doses ready when something is, when the data is ready, and hopefully the data will show that it's not only effective but safe. We'll keep our fingers crossed, but obviously as you go through the filing process, but Pfizer's already manufacturing hundreds of millions of doses at risk. So, I think I really give Albert credit for his conviction around trying to do something in this space and the investment. Again, hundreds of millions of dollars. If you think about a manufacturing process for vaccines, it certainly isn't, an inexpensive endeavor to go at risk, right? Because, like anything else in pharma, it may not work. And the fact that I think Pfizer is doing that and has done it is to me is absolutely amazing, and has done it with such speed. But again, I think that speed's hopefully being balanced by looking at the data and looking at the facts and making sure that, decision on whether to file and whether to approve is based on actually looking at the safety and efficacy as well too. So, that's kind of, my quick spiel.
Yeah, Derek, and I have another follow-up question from the Q&A chat here. I think you're the perfect person to answer it. I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about equity and inclusion across the board, but
Yep.
specifically with regard to the vaccine, do you foresee that there may be challenges in terms of providing equitable global access to the vaccine?
Yeah, there's two answers. There's two different ways to attack that question, just to kind of put it out there. So one, I think there's, even within our own country, making sure that we have diverse population in the trials. And I know Pfizer and I think other companies are aware of this and are trying their best. And, within our communities, there's a lot of, perception on, being in studies, which I think a lot of these companies have to overcome. But it's very important to make sure that these trials are equitable, and that we have the appropriate patients, that we can actually look at data across different, ethnicities and races to make sure that we're getting good results. But I think more on a global level, there are a couple of things that, people need to consider. One, this vaccine needs to be stored at a very cold temperature. So there's cold chain distribution that's really important, right? Which is going to make some challenges for certain areas of the world. So that's just something that needs to be considered. But Pfizer has been working very closely, and I'm sure everyone has seen, Bill Gates and Melinda Gates. They've been all over this, and they're really pushing for medicine to be distributed to all populations. And I think there's a lot of initiatives going on in that manner. So I do think that we will make sure that the medicine gets to the populations that need it all over the world. But I do think, and I have seen and read some articles, that there is some thought going into the prioritization of how this medicine gets distributed, right? For certain people who are at risk, for certain people, Sarah Jo talked about this, who are on the front line. So I think there's some thought around, hopefully we'll get to those people that need it in these markets, in these countries, but there's also hopefully needs to be a prioritization around making sure that it gets to the people who need it the most first, in my opinion, and then distributing over time to others who need it, but just not as much as those who need it urgently. So hopefully that answers the question.
It does. And it's really interesting. Again, today in one of my supply chain classes, we were talking about the whole cold chain and how the price of those specific vaccine boxes, the ones that they can store the vaccine and ship the vaccine and all these sort of things, they're not easy.
No, it's not.
I want to talk about a supply chain room for innovation. That's it right there. And is it Pfizer or was it J&J they've created a unique pallet that's made just for the coronavirus vaccines? I can't remember which company it is.
Yeah, I think it's Pfizer. Pfizer.
Very.
And I think that, people, Sarah Jo mentioned earlier about this, unfortunately going a little bit further than, what some people say in public domain, but, now, this, Blake, right? The logistics around not only the review process of this filing, but the approval, the manufacturing, and the distribution, right? This is not easy. This isn't easy. And, a lot of people trivialize how simple that stuff is, but it's very complicated, to your point. And to be able to not only manufacture the doses, but to distribute them in a way where a lot of people will be able to have access to it, it's going to take some time.
Yeah. Dan, I want to get to you on this point. I want to know, one, maybe your quick example of innovation that's been inspirational to you. And then I also want to talk a little bit about that last point that Derek made there about government approval and this idea of moving it through FDA pipelines. I mean, that's what your position working with governments. I'm sure you do a lot of this. So.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up anyway, because I think, let me start with the second and then answer the first. I think one of the most inspirational stories of innovation within this period, actually in the United States, you got to give a ton of credit to the FDA for the way they've innovated. And when I say innovate, meaning, they are built as any regulatory agency to follow procedure and follow process, and new ways of doing things aren't necessarily what they're necessarily looking for. But they have done a remarkable job across device, pharma, biologics, in keeping that organization operating effectively, taking into account patient safety, taking into account the fact that, all the pressures, if you will, and still getting products through, not just virus related, but getting products, new innovative products through the market in a safe and effective way. So they deserve a ton of credit, and they don't often get that. So that's one piece of inspiration that I would say is worth pointing out. I think each of our companies probably has 25, 30 individual innovative aspects that have come to light during this period of time. I would say for a company like ours, and we're not alone, historically we have been a very face-to-face company. We've been a company that is very much a team approach, but we're a company that has valued being together and working in the workplace, whether you're in manufacturing or any number of settings. It was not our culture to have remote work. That was just not something that we really did. I would say for a company that doesn't have that history, we've done a remarkable job of ingraining and taking advantage of tools and best practice out there around remote work, and being able to do so in a way that has kept our culture really strong. It actually enhanced our communication amongst our teams and allowed us to actually be more productive long term and near term with a lot of people working from home. So I think that's going to pay dividends in the future. Not how we wanted to necessarily move to a more remote workplace, but it's been good to see from that standpoint, and we've seen it all across the organization.
That's great, Dan. Well, Sarah Jo, what are your thoughts on, and you've shared one wonderful piece of innovation, but I know that you are really there on the front line. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of inspirational innovation. And I just want to do real quick, we have about 5 minutes left for this, and then we'll wrap up.
So I'll be quick and say that the pace of research and discovery in medicine right now is spectacular, and it's been met by our partners in the health industry and in big pharma. Repurposing older medicines, testing older medicines, learning that 40 to 50% of severely ill patients with COVID have blood clots, and changing and creating new paradigms, identifying emerging complications of the infection that show up in kids but don't show up in adults, and all this other stuff is just incredible. So coming up with treatment plans has been very innovative. One of the things that we've been trying to do in the cancer population is minimize the exposure of cancer patients to other people. We already try and do that to some extent, but now other people are even sicker and a bigger risk. So we created a drive-up lab. There are many patients who are taking oral treatments for their cancer care, and they don't necessarily need to come into our space to get IV medication, but we need to monitor them with labs. So I set up in the vestibule of one of our buildings, I moved a lab draw station and staffed it with people in PPE, and only for cancer patients who are on oral therapies, they could drive up, only go into the vestibule of the building, only interact with one of our staff members in full PPE, and have their labs drawn and go home, and then be managed virtually. And that way we could keep those patients from ever having to come in contact with other patients. So that was, or other staff. So that was one of our innovations in terms of process flows and all the behind the scenes things, and getting the fire marshal to clear, letting us take over that vestibule and all those other things. So I think those kinds of innovations were really very exciting.
Sarah Jo, you said the word there, process innovation. That's what I love process innovations. And I think that that's a huge piece of what we're seeing right now. It's not only product innovations, but it's process innovations. How can we do things that we've done for, hundreds of years differently? And, I really love that example of the IV drip. That's amazing. It's so simple, but it's not, it's not that simple, but to the people on the front lines, it is that simple.
But the last thing that I'll say is the information management has also been critically important. So from a leadership perspective, communication has been critical, but also setting up the databases so we learn about what we're doing, so we can find those patients who we had to bump off a surgery schedule and bring back. Just our health informatics and business operations teams have also had to do a lot of innovation in managing those things behind the scenes. And I think Dan mentioned his company being a very face-to-face thing. even before this, physician burnout was a big challenge, staff burnout when there's a lot of fear, and then add on to that the isolation of everyone working at home. So there are companies out there doing really interesting things. One of my favorites is called Goat to Meeting. And from an animal sanctuary, you can have a goat or a llama join your Zoom meeting in exchange for a donation to the animal sanctuary. So I did that for our faculty at one point. There's innovation all around us.
That's amazing. That's great. Well, we have just 3 minutes here. I want to do something that I was thinking of, and I thought, you know, should I do it? Should I do it? I'm going to do it. Okay. I'm a dad at heart, and some of you may be moms and dads that are with us. And this is the Kelley Family Week. So I want each of you to spend a minute, 30 seconds to a minute, giving us your best mom or dad piece of advice. And it can be about anything. It can be about how you're going to get through the second wave, things you want to say to people in college, anything that you would want to give as your one piece of mom or dad advice to all of our listeners tonight. And we can start with Dan.
Wow. I thought you were going to ask for me to do my best dad joke, which I could give you 100 of those. I would say, you know, given the topic, I would say, and I recognize, Blake, that students in particular have really done a fabulous job of, you know, embracing mask wearing and distancing and those tools, and it's working. I know the new data is coming out tomorrow from IU, and it's supposed to be even better. So that's awesome. But to people out there, wear a mask. You know, I mean, it's so simple. There have been so few documented cases of transmission of disease from person to person if you do all of the, you know, relatively simple things: wash your hands, wear a mask, socially distance, etc. So, and I recognize it's telling other people, you know, which is the key. So, but my final one is Google YouTube for Disney's wear a mask video, and you'll get a good laugh.
That's great. That's good dad advice. Thank you, Dan. Sarah Jo, do you want to give us your mom advice?
Sure. And I will say that I came professionally of age in New York City during the height of the AIDS epidemic. When we didn't understand AIDS, I was taking care of whole families who were dying of AIDS. And we were worried about getting sick ourselves, needle sticks, nurses refused to care for patients, doctors refused to care for patients. And it changed me. It made me a better doctor, and I think it made me a better person. So I would encourage all of us as we go through this to do an exercise called the history of the future, and think about 20 years from now, looking back on this time. How will you have wanted to behave? What will you have wanted to do? Do you want to remember how you took care of the older people on your street, or how you did something for your company that made a difference? You know, just look from that perspective and remember that these days will shape who you are as a professional, and use this opportunity wisely to become the professional and the person that you want to be.
That's great. Thank you. Dan, you unmuted. Do you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say that's much better advice than mine. That was awesome.
This is going much better than I was expecting it to for mom and dad advice. So this is great. And Derek, what's your final piece of dad advice for us tonight?
Yeah, I'll say two things. I'll make it quick because I know we're on top of the hour. So one, facts are our friends. My old boss used to say that to me. Always follow the facts and drive by facts. I try to be a very fact-based person personally. So I think let information that's accurate drive good decision making. And the second thing is, you know, follow what your passion is. You know, personally, I've been in this industry for 18 years. I love being in conversations about science and hearing about things that really can impact patients. But, you know, for all of you who are listening and thinking about what you're going to do next, follow your passion, because I think ultimately you will get rewarded if you do what you really enjoy and what you really like. So that's my advice.
Well, thank you so much, everybody who's been here with us tonight, and for sharing your passions with us. Truly, like I said, the intellectual horsepower in this virtual room is just insane. I'm telling you, we probably could cure the coronavirus if we had another hour here together, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I want to say thank you so much to our panelists and to all of our friends at the Office of Development and to the KSG Alumni Engagement Committee for putting this all together. And being a moderator has been a great pleasure and a great honor to meet all of you. Thank you so very much for taking some time out of your night.
Thanks.
Thanks for having
this
us.
platform.
Thank you. Good job,
Thank
monitor.
you.
Go Kelley.
That was awesome.
Great job, Blake, as always.
Thanks, Derek. Dan, Sarah, Joe, thank you so much.
Take care.
Good night.
Do well, everybody.